Welcome to Fun with Phylogenetics. We're going to just talk for a few minutes about some of the big concepts in phylogenetics that you need to get comfortable with, be able to use as we sort of go through some of these other discussions of the evolution of behavior. Phylogenetics is the study of the relationships of, and especially evolutionary relationships between different groups of organisms. It's often conflated with and sort of associated with taxonomy. Taxonomy is really the science of, or the organization of the naming of organisms. But phylogenetics takes that naming into a different level because it really looks at sort of how different organisms really are related to each other. So here's a phylogeny of certain groups of carnivorans. Carnivores are animals that eat meat. Carnivorans are a particular taxonomic group. And within the carnivora, we get the felids, and the canids and the mustelids. But from this, you can see like, all right, well, sort of the coyote and the gray wolf, they share a common ancestor with each other. They're part of the same genus, Canis, and they're part of the same family, the Canidae. But the canids are more closely related to the mustelids, which include things like the badger and the otter. So they share a common ancestor here that they do not share with the felids. The felids are on a separate branch, though they are all related to each other because they are all part of the order Carnivora. So when we look at phylogenetic trees, what we're actually doing is understanding or using them to understand how groups of organisms are related to each other. Keep in mind, phylogenetic trees are hypotheses that we continue to test and evaluate. So as you start digging into the literature, what you'll see is that there are a lot of different versions of these trees sometimes, and some of them agree with each other, some of them don't. And that's because we keep collecting new data about the gene sequences, about other sets of traits that we use to build these phylogenetic trees. So, what do we do with this? We need some other background just in terms of what it means to read a tree. So, when we start talking about trees and using these sorts of terms, what we often want to do is start out at this end and look at all the different taxa that we have. Taxon is singular, of taxa, plural. When we have two taxa that are coming off of the same branch, we call those sister taxa. So B and C are sister taxa. A shares a branch with both B and C. So A is the sister taxa, the sister taxon of B and C together. Okay? A, B, and C represent a sister group to D, E, and F. What you'll notice here is that D, E, and F all come off of the same branch. This is what we called an unresolved branch. It means we can't tell, we don't have enough information to know whether or not D and E are more closely related to each other, or E and F are more closely related to each other. So we just represent that as a polytomy, multiple branch points coming off of the same ancestor. But all of these groups are connected to each other via this ancestral lineage. So taxon G, the basal taxon, we sometimes call an outgroup, sort of farther out from everybody else. And this group, A, B, and C, is the sister to D, E, and F within there. Okay? So anytime we start looking at this, we look at the relationships between different taxa on these trees, and those relationships are really represented by these branching points. All right, got that. So how do we actually build these trees? Historically, people have done it in a number of different ways, but it always boils down to the same idea, which is that you look for things that are shared between groups. Two groups, B and C for instance, that share more traits with each other are likely to be more closely related to each other. And those traits could be gene sequences, protein sequences, morphological or physical traits, or behavioral traits. People use all those different sets of things to build phylogenetic trees. When we talk about trees, or traits rather, on those trees, that are shared via common descent, we call those traits homologies. Anything that two organisms or two groups share because that comes from a common ancestor is a homologous trait. Now, sometimes organisms can share traits with other groups, but not via common ancestry, but as a result of convergent evolution, or sometimes just by chance. And those traits are called analogous. Analogies are traits that are shared or that are similar, but not shared via common ancestry. All right. And the last thing we want to hit on is sort of how we refer to different groups. And this is where it's going to get into sort of how we use these phylogenetic trees when we talk about traits within, or behavioral traits within groups of animals. And so we can recognize that there are different ways to refer to groups of animals in phylogenetic trees. A monophyletic group, monophyly, one, lineage, is a group that represents everybody who comes from a single common ancestor. A, B, and C all come from this single common ancestor. They represent a monophyletic lineage or a monophyletic group. A paraphyletic group represents some, but not all, of the organisms or of the individuals that come from a single common ancestor. So D, E, and F are some of the taxa, some of the species that come from this common ancestor, but they're not everybody, because G was left out of this particular group. If we included D, E, F, and G in the group, then this would be a monophyletic lineage. A polyphyletic group includes individuals who come from or do not share a single common ancestor, individuals who come from multiple common ancestors. So A, B, and C, that is a monophyletic group, but D does not come from that lineage, does not share either of these common ancestors with A, B, and C. So why do we care? Well, when we just talk about it with letters, it's hard to actually see. So I'm going to give you an example of birds of prey. Birds of prey, when you think about them, that just what comes to mind, or what hopefully would come to mind, are things like eagles and hawks and falcons and owls and vultures. All of those things fall into a group that we know as birds of prey or raptors. But that group is actually a polyphyletic group. So if we look at birds of prey, so nice little picture of them. Here's your eagle, here's your osprey, some other eagles, some hawks, kites, owls, vultures, secretary bird. They're just kind of awesome. So we can look at sort of the phylogenetic relationships of these groups to each other. So if we start down here, the Accipitriformes, these are eagles, hawks, and kites. And they are connected to this group, which includes the Cathartiformes, the New World vultures. Coming off of these two groups share a common ancestor. They are also coming off this branch and sharing an ancestor with owls, and then the group that includes woodpeckers and cuckoos and kingfishers and hornbills. In fact, all of these things are more closely related to owls than owls are to these other birds of prey. These, not birds of prey, these birds of prey. Up here, got falcons and caracaras. Falcons and caracaras actually are more closely related to songbirds and parrots than they are to any of these other ones. So if we want to look at a group that is birds of prey, and we might want to do that because, say, birds of prey share lots of traits with each other, from hunting style, from the design of their feet, from some of their skeletal features. We can talk about these as birds of prey as a group that shares certain sets of features, but recognize that that group shares those features partly from shared ancestry and partly from convergence. That's one of the important ways to think about how we use these phylogenetic trees as we start talking through these different issues. More on that later.